going. Okay, good. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first book launch of this school year. We'll be starting off this year with a talk by Professor Lee Miller on his new book, The Art of Conjecture. So Lee Miller is a professor of philosophy at Stony Brook, whose past works include Reading Cusanus, published in 2002, and two translations, one of a work by Cusanus called The Layman, and another on the Consolation of Theology by Jean Gerson. He is a recipient of the SUNY Chancellor's Award for teaching and teaches at both the undergraduate and graduate level here at Stony Brook. And his new book, The Art of Conjecture, was published by the Catholic University Press on March 3rd of 2021. For those of you who are on Zoom, please send me a message in the chat if you are interested in being added to the queue for questions so that we can integrate in-person questions with questions that will be from you guys. So without further ado, please welcome Lee Miller.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. And thank you all for coming. I much appreciate this. It's not often in my life that I plan to do something like this and find in the New York Times on the same day an editorial about Google Maps, because this is a paper that talks about Cusanus's interest in maps, and they're basically warning you that Google Maps is mostly there to attract advertising. It's not there to tell you where's what and what's where, as you'll find out if you follow their directions, I guess. So it was great to have a clipping about something that I was going to do. And when the time comes, I may read you a section out of it that I think is very apropos to what I'm saying. This is the copy of my book. And I'm very happy that it came out. I'm very grateful to all the graduate students who helped me with it, and particularly to my wife, Ruth, who was a great help above all. So I'm going to start by standing up and reading, if you don't mind. Nicholas of Cusa is often called a transitional thinker because he stands right between the Middle Ages and the early modern kinds of thought, with which we identify to some extent Descartes, but people were thinking between the Middle Ages and Descartes. Not that he did anything but copy from them, but he doesn't acknowledge them very much. So Nicholas of Cusa's writings illuminate how even a theological text of the 15th century can evolve as pre-modern thinking. He often selected some contemporary invention, artifact, or device and employed it as a symbol or analogy for his conjectural, theological, and philosophical reflections. In a late work of his, the Compendium of 1464, Nicholas takes the act of map making beyond the merely geographical or textual and into the realm of mind and imagination, thus demonstrating an intuitive grasp of the import and flexibility of both geophysical maps and their metaphorical or conjectural extensions. He writes, therefore, a completely developed animal in which there is both sense and intellect is to be likened to a geographer who dwells in a city that has 5 gateways of the 5 senses. Through these gateways, messengers from all over the world enter and report on the entire condition of the world. Chapter 8 of his late compendium turns to a map maker or cosmographicus who constructs an imaginary city map as a way of organizing human sense perception and its deliverances. This mapmaker image also calls attention to the then rising interest in more geographical accurate and complete geophysical maps. A late 15th century map of Central Europe is still attributed to Nicholas, though we have no independent textual evidence or reference to his own map making. I think the reason it's attributed to Nicholas is that 2 of the spots on it were the place he was born, Ebersberg in Germany, and where he was later a very unsuccessful bishop in Bressanone, which is between Germany and Italy. The map maker in Nicholas's conjectural comparison, however, in his book, begins by envisioning his external senses as the 5 gates of a city where he lives, gates that are open to messages from without. Late medieval cities were often represented in diagrams and paintings as circular. So we might imagine this quasi-circular walled city as circumscribing a pentagon, with a gate at each of the 5 vertexes in equal distances from the powers of the human mind: sense, imagination, memory, and reason. The results are organized here as the conjectural contents of an imagined map or cartographic construction. Both the structure and the contents of this map lead us to reflect on map making itself. A map maker presents a diagram or chart that, through its 2-dimensional matrix and conventions, selects, focuses, and limits what its users can understand about the part of the earth it traces and represents. Users are expected to become familiar with the conventions, standardized scaling, legends, and other symbols portrayed on the map. I think most up-to-date automobiles have shown you how to use Google Maps, and you know all those conventions. As a result, what users see is a selective representation that omits much in the physical landscape. They also assume that there are alternative ways of mapping the physical locales in particular places and the connections between them. The Cusanus map attributed to Nicholas is an advanced example of such geographic mapping. Contrasting what one sees at a physical locale with what one sees on a map may also be a useful exercise. What one perceives visually from a given standpoint can be divided into foreground, middle ground, and background, all the way to the horizon, to use the terms from landscape painting and photography. While looking at a map shows us the measurable relationships between places using lines and symbols, visiting a place reveals much more extensively the actual perceptual depth and visible qualities of a given locale. All that is perceivable in an abstraction that both reorients us to a larger context and invites us to a different viewpoint than what we can see from where we stand here and now. If we look again at Nicholas of Cusa's Cosmographicus, his geographer, we return to his final move from the humanly constructed map and its contents to the divine creator. Nicholas writes, "The geographer dismisses the messengers, closes the gateways, and turns his inner sight towards the creator of the world, who is none of all those things about which the geographer has learned from the messengers, but who is the maker and cause of them all. He considers this maker to stand antecedently in relation to the whole world, as he himself, as geographer, stands in relation to the map. While taking careful stock of what he's constructed, he does not simply feast his eyes on the results of his metaphorical mapping. He takes us a further step, the one that counts most for Cusanus in this context, using his inner sight or intellectual intuition to move beyond what he's come to know and has inscribed conjecturally on his mental map of the mind's contents. The map maker attempts to transcend his construction toward what no earthly map can capture at all, namely the maker and cause of all that is and can be. Nicholas does this so he can drive home a straightforward but conjectural proportion or analogy. As the map maker is to his map, so the creator is to the whole perceptible universe." In his compendium, Nicholas has the map maker look at the map, dismiss the messengers, close the gates to the city, and leaving the perceptible world, reflect that the whole exercise has been in fact an image of God's relation to the created universe. As the map maker stands to the map of mental contents, so God stands to all created things. If we transform the initial analogy or proportion by alternation, an even more telling implication is that the constructed conjectural map stands to the actual perceptual world as the map maker stands to the divine creator. We human beings thus become intellectual signs, even conjectural maps of God. According to Cusanus, any human symbol maker is thus him or herself a sign of the ultimate maker of the universe. Nicholas asserts here in his compendium that the human cosmographicus is the first and nearest sign of the creator. He proceeds to propose that even though this will not change or open up God's incomprehensibility for us, it will at least move us into the immaterial realm of intellect and invite us past the limits of human conceptual space to that conjectural domain where the divine incomprehensibility may best shine forth in our darkness. To see the borders of what his map includes is ipso facto to be beyond them, whether transcending those limits moves us towards his God or not. What is notable in this brief passage is that Nicholas implicitly recognizes the creative power that the mind exerts in constructing such a conjectural symbolic map of the human perceptual system and its deliverances. By combining his experience with actual maps and his realization of what maps enable us to understand in spatial and visual terms, he's able to capture all of the geophysical universe, as it were, in an imagined diagram that reflects the power of human mentality, not to mention the human spirit's internal drive to transcend itself and its creations. As always, Nicholas urges us to go beyond our map making to the divine creator of what the mental map reflects. In a sermon he preached some years earlier in his diocese of Brixen, Nicholas also compared the treasures of wisdom in the human mind to a map of a rich and fruitful field. He wrote, "Just as if the form of the world or the chart of a map were to bear in itself the likeness of the universe and contain in itself everything, the world would be reflected in it intellectually. So then in this reflection, the intellect would see in itself whatever it wished to know." Here, Nicholas celebrates the human mind as a conjectural treasure house of conceptual forms. This leads us to realize that he understands that human creativity is remarkable, that human diagrams and maps of the mind and of geophysical reality credit our ability as conjectural world makers, whether the world is physical or mental, on paper or in imagination. First and nearest signs of the creator we may be, but we too articulate our conjectural understandings of the created world in what he calls well-ordered and proportional designaciones. We draw on our experience with geometrical diagrams and other visual constructions in 2 dimensions to lay out what we've taken in from the world, making our perceptual experience available anew by combining proportional signs to stand for what we can see and know. This passage recalls his earlier De Conjecturis on conjectures, where Nicholas proposes that man is a human god, a parallel to his naming human beings, finite gods, and deduct ignorantia. In his later De Berillo, Nicholas quotes with approval Hermes Trismegistus's terming of humans as second gods. What is finally godlike is not only the fact that we design and construct and use via the mechanical arts all the novel artifacts of his time that so intrigued Nicholas, but here in particular, we're able to order and create mental maps or conjectural diagrams that lay out our understanding of what we know and how we come to know it. If we recall that Nicholas's layman in his book on the mind emphasized that the mind measures in constructing its conjectures, we can see that his map of the mind is just such a visual measurement. Here is a map that measures human cognition in a clearly selective way, mapping its borders as the 5 senses and the mind's power both as striving and is able to transcend what it senses, imagines, and conceptualizes. Interior borders that Nicholas believes must be surpassed in reaching for the God beyond all mapping. not just the map that is made, but the very making of the map and the understanding and experience it authorizes fit our natures as creative second gods and proximate, if conjectural, signs of the divine creator. Nicholas is a pre-modern figure in part because it was not long after his death that the thinkers of Northern Europe, whose locations we may find on the Cusanus map, at least in Germany, rejected the Roman Church he defended. Later, less openly, some questioned the God for whom he longed. It is a very short step from taking us to be second gods to eliminating the first God, who Nicholas admits is beyond any conjectural proportions we can construct for measuring such a transcendent reality. Once this faith in a God beyond human intelligence and understanding is challenged as a perhaps futile hope, the only God that is left is humanity itself. What we realize is that a map combines what it omits with what it includes. A conjectural map of the mind and its knowledge of the physical universe may and perhaps should fail to capture the putative God on whom everything supposedly depends. Given his own principle that there's no proportion between the finite and the infinite, Nicholas's map maker must leave out God, who's beyond all designation, as he says. His conjectural map may thereby cut two ways. One way includes religious faith, the other way may not. Whether we care about this possibility or not, we must admire the human capacities that map making and indeed conjectural cognition itself requires. Nicholas often speaks in his writings of human sense perception, imagination, and rational understanding, all capacities that contribute to human knowledge, its conceptual contents, and its artistic products. In this book, the compendium, all of this is discussed again and interpreted in terms of natural and conventional signs and conjectural metaphors, such as that of the map maker. The irony is that Nicholas's mental map of the perceptible world barely mentions all the human faculties that are needed for its construction inside the imaginary city gates. Perhaps this is because cognitive activities such as thinking and imagining are not open to straightforward sense perception. But those activities are all implicitly present in the ordering and proportioning that the finished conjectural product displays. What is the metaphor that best captures human mentality? Two terms from Nicholas of Cusa can open leads for our own reflections. One is his insistence we can never know the essence of anything, since that essence is identical with God. Our knowledge, Nicholas says, is always conjectural, true as far as it can go, but always perspectival and open to further insight. In his own words, quote, "You have seen that precise truth is unattainable, and so it follows that every human affirmation of what is true is a conjecture," end quote. Nicholas thinks of this conjectural knowledge as resulting from human measuring. Measuring is the second term he stresses because we take the measure of what we want to know from a particular standpoint and in terms of a conventional standard. Here, once again, exactness escapes us. Conjecture and measure are both quasi-technical terms that never quite lose their metaphorical resonance in Nicholas's writing. That is why his metaphor of map making is so apt. To make a map is to fabricate a conjectural world in a symbolic representation that, from a particular viewpoint, takes the conjectural measure of all that it includes. While Nicholas's maps of mentality and its cognitive contents may be conjectural and symbolic, it's useful to recall that conjectural signs and symbols themselves may always involve a kind of cognitive mapping. The reason is that every symbol is a conjectural measure that involves likeness and difference. The best symbols and conjectures use the differences to underline the likenesses we may not have noticed or may have missed. We are led to examine carefully what we're talking about and trying to understand, even if the terms of the symbol seem far-fetched or foreign. Symbol and metaphor enable us to step across the conventional boundaries of literal description and definition to see what we're dealing with from the outside, and even sometimes from an inside we had not previously entertained. Nicholas's conjectural city map of mentality and its contents is an example of how an extended enigma or symbol can defamiliarize us so that we look at the human mind's working and results in a different light. Nicholas imagines city gates demonstrate how this works. By transferring this characteristic of the gates to sense perception, we add to our understanding of sensing, even if we use our previous perceptual experience to understand what other characteristic of gates probably do not apply. The senses, after all, are hardly city gates. We sort and make judgment about which of a gate's qualities really fit the sensorium, and we test them against our previous experience. Yet we allow those gate-like parallels that extend the way we previously imagined both gates and sensation. We can open or close our senses to some degree, and the messages they gather about the perceptual world require our sorting and ordering. Nicholas has selected two somewhat unlikely terms, whose connection can further our understanding. Aristotle remarked that employing a metaphor requires an inventive eye for likenesses. Let's just see just how astute our conjectural judgments of fit and appropriateness can be. One can imagine, for instance, being blocked or confused in sorting or comparing what sensation amounts to, and wishing one had a map or diagram so one could better locate and relate the different deliverances of sense perception, whether they came from bodily organs or in conceptual space. Working in this situation, we can use mapping or diagramming in order to judge better just what sensation involves. What a conjectural map of a city's gates and the information that comes through them spells out explicitly may, with a quick turn of phrase, clarify and situate the somewhat confusing sensorium all at once by bringing in a telling comparison. Nicholas's Cosmographicus, or map maker, is just such a conjectural creative image of mental interpretation and construction. While maps are visualizations, they're also selective abstractions. Geophysical maps simplify the physical landscapes they cover, and thus can give useful directions for where we want to go. Symbolic and conjectural maps can help us find the neighborhood of what we want to understand and to locate ourselves in such a way that we may discover or invent in visually imaginative terms what it is that we seek. They have a heuristic function as well as an explanatory one. For instance, maps designate borders within the territories they depict. The maps themselves, in turn, have their own borders or limits. And in this way, maps invite us to recall that we are somehow beyond what we grasp as a limit, even if we cannot fill out, always at least, what lies on the other side. There's an outside to any perspective we represent in our conjectural construction or mapping of human knowledge, as the histories of philosophy and psychology remind us. The mapping in compendium and in the sermon demonstrates how important spatial and visual depiction and metaphors are to Nicholas of Cusa. We read his mathematical works and his vain attempts to square the circle with their proportions and geometrical diagrams, and we notice the importance of geometry and diagrams and mathematical examples and symbols throughout his other theoretical works. We must conclude that while Nicholas's heart and soul may have longed for the inexpressible and incomprehensible God, his mind and imagination were located squarely in the visible and visually imaginative world. For him, humans are signs of God as conjectural knowers and mental map makers. Our own constructive, intelligent activity in such mapping is a powerful experience that lets us see ourselves as conjectural human maps or signs representing and directed toward the divine. The conjectural imagery that Nicholas employs to transform ordinary perfection of three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional diagrams, charts, and proportions, like the proposed symbolic map of the compendium, is another instance of the powerful spatial visual methods Nicholas employs to communicate what he understands and believes. His conjectural views in their presentation are an opening and an invitation for us to understand both the late medieval thought world from which Nicholas comes and the new Renaissance and early modern ideas that so much in his work foreshadows. Cousin conjectures about God's unknowability can seem a kind of preview or foretaste of what was soon to appear as early modern skepticism and doubt about what could be known of the mind's actions and the resulting knowledge. This was the skepticism that led to Descartes' effort to secure a foundation for philosophical thought in the mind's awareness of its own thinking. Those who followed Descartes up to Kant and Hegel agreed or disagreed with Descartes about the scope and validity of human knowledge, but none took up the Cousin insight that all the sayings of the wise are conjectures. Both empiricists and rationalists fled such ideas in search of some secure foundation for true knowledge, even to the point of making what they said about God a function of their own thinking. Nicholas of Cusa was hardly an early modern thinker. Despite his interest in describing the human mind and our ways of knowing, we find two continuing directions in his thinking that demonstrate this important difference. In his writings from the mid-1450s to the end of his life, he consistently returns to his initial conjectures about God's nature and God's unknowability for human beings, looking again at the coincidence of opposites. Nicholas continues to propose imaginative conjectures about God as ways of leading us to what we may not understand apart from religious faith, but what he thought is crucial for us to acknowledge and address in terms of our own knowing. Thanks very much. So what I found in the main editorial in the New York Times is the writer blasting Google Maps for being about money, namely in terms of the advertising that goes with them. And then lots of times just putting in the wrong information. But what he says about maps seems to me to be exactly true of what maps are about. He says at the end of the article, good maps articulate not just what we know, but also the limits of our knowledge, where the known world ends and where the unknown begins. But as long as we're reliant on maps that mislead us by not acknowledging where those boundaries lie, we're doomed to believe in a world that is in some ways imaginary. So be careful using Google Maps. They don't hesitate to put in things that aren't there. The author says at one point he put in the name of a place and it's still on Google Maps. This was some years ago. So we have to remind us that maps have this power because they take charge of the space in which we live in ways that we don't always realize. And they can help get us from place to place or see the relationship between places. But it's never the same as when you drive through them or walk through them yourself. So that abstraction from the actual realities that sometimes will get us where we're trying to go really misleads us in terms of what perceptible reality is all about. So we have to watch the maps and be careful with them and take a look at that editorial today. It's called The Maps That Steer Us Wrong. What I like about Nicholas's thing is he understands how maps work. They would have never named a map after him. And he understands how you can use it to go beyond what maps do. And that, I think, is the real burden of what I'm trying to talk to you about today, and the best part of my exploration of his map of a map maker who brings in God. I should also tell you that the stuff about the senses as gateways of the mind go way back in the Western tradition, and particularly in St. Augustine, who he knew intimately. You can find them there. So it's not something he invented, but it's something he took from the tradition he inherited and placed in a new light, in a new way, that makes us think again about mapping and think again about how we map the conceptual contents of what we know. That's one of the chapters from the book, The Art of Conjecture, that this is supposedly about. And it's chapter 3, the Cusanus map and the map maker. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Okay. For the people who are, sorry, I know we're spread out funny. If you're on Zoom, I'm gonna go unmute the front computer and you can take turns asking your questions. And I see that Allegra's first. So as soon as I unmute it, you can ask your question. Hold on a second.
I think I am unmuted. Am I? Yeah. So I have a question, namely, Lee, if you could, I don't know if this is possible in a few words, but I'm very, very curious about how Cusanus bridges, or maybe does not bridge, the human imagination with God's inintelligibility. He is muted.
I'm sorry.
Okay, can you
You
hear me?
have to repeat it.
Well, I don't think he ever really copes with the fact that God is beyond our telling and our understanding.
Mhm.
And one of the gorgeous things about reading him is that that's a way of making sure that what was traditionally called God's transcendence or God's being beyond everything created is preserved, at least for believers. People talk about God all the time, but the language and the imagination forces us perhaps to imagine God like another human being, to talk of God like we talk of other human beings. And except in the case for Christians of Jesus, there's no way that one can really do that and make any sense. How do you talk about God doing this or planning that when you know that God's being, as Augustine put it, is an eternal now, and that it doesn't proceed from past to future? That's something in our experience. That's why it seems to me that most of the things that we say when people die are things that we say to other human beings. They aren't things we say really about God. We talk about the life that was lived, and we talk about the people who were influenced by the life, but we don't talk about what's going to happen to this person now, except sometimes we do because we know that the other person believes that something good will happen to the person, and you want to perhaps console them by confirming that. But philosophically, we have all these books about God and all these essays about God, and basically, I agree with Nicholas here that we're really struck dumb by the possibility that God presents to human knowledge. You have to transcend human conceptualization. I don't know what that means. I sometimes feel lucky I have human conceptualization, let alone that I can transcend it. I don't think I answered your question, but that's how I see this.
Thank you.
Good question, Lee. Thanks so much for your talks. It was great to think about this again. So you talked about the desire for certainty that is kind of the hallmark of modern thinking. And I was thinking that there's kind of a parallel between the desire for certainty and maybe the desire for total map, or the map that will kind of show us everything. Which, and Nicholas Acuda seems to be very skeptical of that absolute certainty of knowledge and this kind of absolute map. I was wondering if you could talk more about the role of faith for Nicholas Acuda, and whether you see the link between faith and certainty, and whether, because it almost seems like through his faith, he's kind of giving up the desire for certainty. whereas we might think of faith as this precisely as like a craving for certainty.
Well, that certainly is maybe the background against which he does the philosophical musings that he does on conjecture. But he never says that anywhere, so I'm not sure. And mostly he talks about faith and hope and love in pastoral contexts where he's giving sermons and so on. So I never know how much of that is measured by the audience he's speaking with or measured by the tradition out of which he comes. So it's really interesting to figure out how you can be a loyal Christian and a skeptic at the same time about human knowledge and possibilities. That's why I think that the third section of his book De Docta Ignorantia is so important, because that's the section where he puts together in his own way what it is to be human and what it is to be divine in the Christ, so that believers have actually something to think about. It's hard to imagine that there's another human being who's been loved as much as Christ has been loved. And I think that it's in terms of that that most people are thinking when they remember how Christ, in the life that's told us in the stories about him, the story about Lazarus and his trying to console the two sisters, Martha and Mary, is a terrific story, I think, for understanding the way Christians approach the mysteries of life and death, and how they think that they can rely on the Christ to show them what God amounts to, even if they have no real purchase on God. So that's the way in which I would say that he might combine his faith and his incredible position as a cardinal of the Roman Church at a time of its greatest, what should I say, perversity, or at least corruption. You know, they tell a story of him when he was an advisor of the Pope going into Pius II. This Pius tells this in his own diaries. Going into Pius II and telling him that he should not give these bishoprics or these holdings to his relatives. That was not the way to help the church at all at this point. And when he thought about it and talked to him about it, he broke down into tears in front of the Pope. The Pope relates all that, and at the end of the story, he says, "So I went out and gave them to my nephews." It's a perfect example of the kind of situation that you were in at that point in the mid-Renaissance in Italy, where the Italians thought that the Germans were pretty much barbarians. They'd all read what Tacitus wrote about Germans, because they discovered the one manuscript that we have of his De Germania. And so they didn't change their minds just because somebody was like Nicholas and knew a lot. They thought he was, what should I say, the exception that proved the rule. But they found out within 25 years or 30 years, 40 years after his death, that there was an incredible desire among the German Christians to become more true to their faith and less indebted to the clergy. So it's a story of corruption and reform. Maybe the reform was too rigid, but the corruption was widespread. And it's not surprising that the so-called Catholic Church reformed itself in such a rigid manner. I don't think Nicholas is going to help you much with putting faith together with understanding in terms of your conceptual categories. What he does is try to put faith together with your life in the way that you live. And that, it seems to me, is the challenge of any religion. You have these beliefs. What have they done to your life? And he was well known as somebody who started off as having no money at all. And in the end, he set up a retirement home for old men in his hometown. And that foundation, although I don't know that it's still a retirement home, is still there today. His library, which somehow or other escaped all the destruction and wars that have happened since his time, between Napoleon and the 2 world wars, managed to escape being bombed. So we have a really good idea of the books that he read and the books that he loved and the ones that he's actually made notes in. Some of them were just bindings together manuscripts. When he was a young man, he was an advisor to some bishops, and in his free time, he would go to the monasteries nearby and look in their libraries, because a lot of monasteries were full of people who couldn't read. And those who could read only the approved books, namely Augustine, or the prayers of the church that they sang. So he kept finding things, and he found a manuscript of one of Plautus's plays that he then tried to sell, because he didn't have any money then. He wasn't yet a priest, and he wasn't completely bound up with anyone except the diocese he tried to represent there. But his intelligence quickly distinguished him. And I think that's what led to some of his successes later. That and his obvious piety. Even in the cases where he tried to straighten things out, had trouble. But I don't have a very good answer for how he put together faith and reason. It seems to me that they both are very radical when you get down to it. The reason we do philosophy is because it radicalizes us as intellects. It makes us go beyond the normal ways in which our culture thinks. The reason we do religion is it radicalizes our heart. It helps us to understand why love is so important and how it is possible in loving others to be connected with the divinity. So both of them are really important, it seems to me, for at least Christian philosophers. And I don't doubt that's true of Jewish philosophers and also Arabic philosophers as well.
Thanks.
David, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee, for your brilliant talk as usual. I don't have much to say. That I have a lot to say, but I want to say a little. See, Akuza thinks within the world of St. Paul, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity.
Right.
Now, once you reduce the theological dimension, so to speak, to the merely human, as you said, then you get the religion of humanity. And in that framework, human beings name things, whether in theology, corrupt theology, or science, or everything else. And that's called nominalism. But Kuza's position was that of symbolic representation, as you said. And symbolic representation has at its very root the idea that everything is metaphorical or conjectural. Matter of fact, metaphorical and conjectural translate one another. And I wanted then to just make a plug for Peirce, Charles Peirce. He has the exact same position. He says if you operate in science or anything else at the level in indexical symbols, man is a sign making, and then you're pointing out within the human framework. But all symbols are representational. That is to say, they're symbolic. And the very nature of the symbol is that it's inexhaustibly general, or instantiates in inexhaustible open frameworks of generality, you see. And so symbols are generative of other symbols and other symbols. They're conjectural or metaphorical in this sense. They can't be reduced to indexical symbols or positivistic symbols or the whole world of nominalism, which has dominated the modern world. So Kuza was a truly transitional figure from the Christian medieval to the modern, but he also undercut the modern in the Cartesian or sense of certitude, or of the British empirical sense of certitude, or even Hegel, you end up with the certitude of the system. These are all nominalistic systems, which he has undercut in advance with the idea that the mind is essentially conjectural or metaphorical or symbolical. And that involves the metaphysical dimension or the dimension of faith, hope, and charity. I could go on, but that's the gist of the.
Thank you very much.
point.
I don't think I can add to that right offhand.
And you could also, by the way, you could go beyond references to genuine Jewish or Islamic traditions or Christian traditions, Asian traditions too, whether Taoism or Mahayana Buddhism or Hinduism. They also have this sense of the vertical dimension in human experience, so that human experience it's not adequately explained in human terms. There's always a vertical dimension, a metaphysical dimension, and fallibly, of course, in a limited way, we're capable of experiencing this dimension of the divine in our experiences. It's in the Asian metaphysical traditions as well as the Western metaphysical tradition. It has the deep roots in Plato and Aristotle, of course, as you know, better than I. So Kuzo is really the conduit through which the whole great metaphysical tradition of the West moves, it seems to me. And it lends in Peirce. Peirce has the exact same, what do you call that, ontological semiotics. So symbolism is not reducible to it, and dexicality.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I hadn't thought of that quite that way before.
Okay, our next question is going to, so I can hear myself. It's going to be from Bob.
Question about map. You talk about maps. Maps are related to two things. They're related to cognition, sort of representation, and they're related to desire. They allow us to do things with reason. And in fact, they're principally desire, I think. But the danger, of course, is that we view the map as the real thing. So, but the desire is very important. You know, we want to go beyond the code. We want to find out what's missing. We want to help reveal what's been concealed and so forth. And I'm not sure is that distinction important for you, the cognitive versus the active? And how is that related to you would compare the map to the territory, to the map maker, and the relation between the map maker and the creator, how that works out in that latter analogy.
Well, I suppose the map maker makes the map just like God made the world in some kind of way, in a very simple sense. Or another way to put it is that we get a picture of the physical locale on a map because somebody designed a map that would show us, selective features of it. Just as the way, from a certain metaphorical perspective, God designed the world as we experience it. Or to put it another way, God is the creator, and the creation is not something that's temporal. Creation is something that's eternal. That means in the very now in which we live, God is creating. Not in the sense of bringing something from nothing, but in the sense of sustaining what is natural in our world. So I think that the crucial thing that's being left out here is not just desire, but power. People make maps so they can show where my property ends and where yours begins. This is mine, that's yours. People make maps so they can show where one country ends and the next country begins. And the disputes over property lines between countries have sometimes led to war. So if you want to know what people love, there's two things you can do. You can look to power or you can look to money. And this thing that I read in the paper this morning is about really making money. Not surprisingly, well, it surprised me in a way. I didn't realize that they would manipulate the map to take care of their advertisers. Now, I shouldn't be surprised by that because we have what should I say, a society that's beholden to money in every respect. Or society in every respect beholden to money. So your point about love and desire is really well taken. But what do we want from a map? Most of us who use maps, for example, in our car on the GPS or whatever, want to know how to get from point A to point B. But it's interesting what things on the map from point A to point B are pointed out on Google. Which stores? Which restaurants? How did those get there? I wasn't interested in those. I just want to know how to get from point A to point B. So we can see that what people want from a map is not simply a design that lets us relate one locale to another or several locales within a vicinity, but what people want to make out of that. And of course, that's a matter of their desire, isn't it? So I would say that the point you made about desire works in every map, even a map maker whose heart is pure and whose intentions are to really show you what's what in some kind of symbolic form. I think that this is a good example of the things we make and how we make them show us what we are and how we love. Cusanus made a map to remind us that the world belongs to God and that all the things we construct can be used as representations of that or connections to that or reminders of that. I mean, he doesn't even fill out the map because he wants to turn immediately to God, who transcends all sorts of mappings, particularly the human mappings. So I appreciate your comment. I think that's exactly right about desire. We can't even keep our maps from wanting the wrong things. Go ahead.
So, so God is beyond representation and is, unintelligible in this higher sense, right? Unknowable or whatever negative term one would use for such an exalted situation, right? Or category or being, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, Cusanus is focused on these geometrical as well as arithmetical symbols, like the 1 times 1 equals 1, the tetragonus primus, and all these, and he has maps already in this like more geometrical mode, like the figura paradigmatis or pyramidalis, either way. Right? He has all this interest in these geometrical as well as arithmological now, and they're more than symbols, right? Or they're different than just symbols. They're symbols, but they're also like what Dilworth was calling indexicals, right? They're signs that are specifically geometrico-rational, right? So they're not supposed to be reductions only, as the world or the territory is reduced into a map, but can also be read the other way, as like a hieroglyphic, right? Symbols of the divine, right? Or of the relations to the divine. And so in that way, aren't they like these bridges that Allegro was asking about? And don't they fulfill a kind of a bridge from faith in the divine to certainty about the relationship that we have with the divine, by analogy, or whatever we call this power, conjectural cognition. So the art of conjecture, it's not just about like imagination or things like that, right? This is all exalted mode of thinking, conjectural cognition, right? So I guess what I'm asking is, don't we actually, in fact, through these symbols, or maybe through certain of these symbols, have a kind of representation, or maybe representation isn't the right word, but some kind of indication of the divine, of like God, right? And specifically what I'm getting at is his interest in this infinite sphere image from the pseudo-hermetic tradition that he draws on in certain works, right? So this image isn't just a sphere, but is God, right? So in these geometrical symbols, that there's like an exalted form of cognition, right? So, I mean, it just sounded to me like we want to separate God from the human grasp, but at the same time, we are able to bridge or grasp some aspects of God, right? According to Chrysanus and through all of the systematic things that he has, despite God's ultimate unknowability or inintelligibility, or whatever, term one uses.
Well, I think that that's a very nice way of putting the idea that the symbols point beyond the things that we can grasp directly, but they may point us towards something that should be a different sort of object for us than the things we can grasp. To the idea that something is transcendent, something is beyond us, that there is a place in our thinking and in our imagining where we can use some of his symbolic diagrams as pointers, as places to put our desires and our knowledge, as on the way to something. Well, I think that's all I have to say about it. I really appreciate those remarks. And unless somebody has another question. Okay.
Okay, so this question is from Mary Marr. It says, we alluded to the impossibility of squaring the circle with traditional Euclidean straight edge and compass constructions. What do such impossibility proofs say about our minds in relation to God's?
I don't think that Nicholas ever says what he was trying to do in squaring the circle with reference to God. He was trying to get the circle squared. I think that was that occurs in his purely mathematical works. And of course, he didn't have more advanced mathematics like we supposedly do. But I have always thought of that as a really good example of what it means when somebody claims that they know something about God. It's like squaring the circle using simple geometric means. You're going to be frustrated, buddy. And I think Nicholas was interested in mathematics all his life. And he kept trying to do it by a method of proportions. And it just wouldn't work because guess what? A curved line is different from a straight line. And I think it's you, Gary, that told me all this.
Yeah, we talked about it a long time ago.
Yeah, well, I haven't forgotten. I really appreciate what you said then.
Well, I was interested in straight edge and compass constructions because you might think of that as the computer of ancient times, and kind of an algorithm of ancient times. And you could do things with straight edge and compass, which you can't do with digital computers. And it's kind of an interesting discovery.
That's great.
You can trisect the angle and so forth if you can use infinite series. And so it seems to fit along with Cusanus's idea of taking the straight line as the limit of larger and larger circles. I think that was the example that you had talked to me about.
Right. And the reason that seems to work is because you're looking at them as if you could get them in a visual perspective.
Yeah. But you can actually do some of these things like squaring the circle and trisecting the angle and doubling the cube if you allow infinite series of constructions.
I see. Fine. I don't know that I see, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, it's just that, a lot of the traditional impossibility proofs depended on things like not marking the straight edge, or that the constructions had to be finite.
Right.
But if once you take away some of those restrictions, you get, for example, it's possible to trisect an angle, it's possible to square the circle and double the cube. So it just, it's of this kind of infinite regress idea. If it was allowed, many things would have been possible, like Zeno's paradox solutions to it and other things. So if, just to take your map metaphor, for example, is the map itself on this map? If the map itself is on the map, all of a sudden you will get this infinite regress, because the map itself will have to have the map on it and so forth. And these kind of singular wholes are, possible. And actually it's the kind of thing that people do now, using fractals, using symmetry on descending scales. It was all in ancient times that these things were there, but they were declared, irrational or impossible at the time.
Right.
I just wondered whether Cusanus might have had a more accepting view of infinite series and infinite constructions, given that he thought the line was the limit of concentric circle, ever expanding circles.
Well, I have to admit that there's much about Cusanus's mathematics that I don't know very well. And so I really wouldn't be able to say exactly what he thought about those things. But every time you talk to me about it, I realize, boy, this is really interesting. I should get into the mathematics of Cusanus as well and have another conversation with you.
Well, he had proofs of the area of pi and so forth by taking, cutting up a circle into the pi parts and sitting there and looking at the limit. So it seems that he was on to the idea of limits.
Yes, he certainly was.
Well, thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate so much your comments and your questions.
Can you take one more question? I can ask it. One more question?
Sure, of course.
Okay, this one's from Peter Carametta.
Great.
It's
Hi,
very
Peter.
long, so bear with me. Sorry. If God is unintelligible, we can still know his creation or created human beings. Cusanus states that knowledge can only come by way of assimilation and measurement, ultimately by conjecture. Does Cusanus say anything specific or different or new for the times about how these conjectures are articulated outside of the realm of logic proper? In other words, how does conjecture turn into belief? Isn't there a premise for God being a human creation, namely what everyone says is God is, without actually knowing God?
Well, you have to, I think, Peter, you have to factor faith into that to make it come true, so to speak. I also think that you can't, it's hard for me to understand and appreciate as much as perhaps I should, what the tradition really bequeathed to Nicholas of Cusa. He didn't have a typical university education. He was trained in canon law. And he learned, like the stuff he learned from mathematics, he had some friends who were real mathematicians who kept telling him, no, you got it wrong. But he put together a whole bunch of ideas that were around. He had some really interesting and creative friends in Italy. And he was a great talker and a great socializer in the sense that he didn't hesitate ever to ask somebody what they thought. I don't think that the notion of conjecture really loses the idea of something being as true as far as it goes, but not capturing all the truth there is to say about something. That seems to me to be our constant situation. Lots of things we say are true as far as they go, but they aren't the whole truth. most of us forget to say as far as they go. We just say, well, that's true. But I don't think there's any kind of truth that's just truth, at least for human beings. There's always places we can go further to understanding what we're complaining about or what we're saying. And conjecturing for him is like our getting a group of people together and asking them their opinion about something and trying to make sense out of the opinions, what we think is the best opinion we got. It isn't just in the realm of where we do that is human projects and stuff like that, or in having a group plan its future. But even in things that seemed all settled, he was not willing to say, that's settled, this is what we say. He's willing to say, this is what we say, and it's true as far as it goes, but it isn't the whole truth. That seems to me to be a wonderful way of characterizing what philosophers, sort of an ethic for philosophers. Don't claim too much, or be sure you put in where you think what your claim is falters.
Well,
Go ahead.
if I may,
Sure.
my argument is based on the fact that while in that same century, there was a lot of developments in logic going on, especially, in Oxford, Paris, and so on.
Sure.
There was also a tendency among some humanists, and especially I've been focusing lately on Lorenzo Valla, in which not only do you have a long discussion and research into proof of documents, proof of authenticity, a struggle to identify what is an actual statement source and what is a forgery, for instance. But there is also a tendency in Valla, who, by the way, it was by reading Cusanus that I learned that he anticipated the critique of the donation of Constantine by 4 or 5 or 10 years, and Valla was aware of that. What I mean is that logic at one point begins to be something that cannot really answer the question of how do we know God, or what is God, and so on. So Valla and others, like even Leonardo Bruni and others, seem to think that basically you have to do it through rhetoric. And rhetoric here is something positive in my case, in my way of looking at it. That is, it's public discourse, it's persuasion. And like you said, if enough people in a room believe that the sky is green and not blue, and the people in that room are the only ones who are writing the history and the science of that moment, then it doesn't matter whether there's the ultimate truth that it's now that it's blue. We know that afterwards. Why? Because at that particular moment, that's what we know logically, and we cannot answer the question of God logically, so we have to answer rhetorical. That is, we have to answer it through the articulation of these conjecture. Could be like hypotheses which then people start to believe in and become something concrete. So in a way, what I'm trying to do is trying to see how at the same time that there is a development and a separation between logic and rhetoric, rhetoric was already persuasion, public discourse, intersubjectivity, if you wish, was already ahead of the game, was already pointing to language as the only discourse, persuasive discourse as the only way you can talk about that which you cannot know logically. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I hadn't quite thought about it that way. I think that's really fascinating. I know that one of the things that characterizes Nicholas is he was in constant correspondence with others.
Yeah.
And not only that, he traveled up and down the Rhine so many times, he must have been sick of it. But it's because he kept going to all the cathedral chapters and all the monasteries there, trying to get them to shape up and reform and become real Christians, instead of the monasteries being dumping grounds for unmarried people, and the canons, places where you could make a living without doing much. So,
Spet Godfly.
so it's a real difficulty to separate his reforming efforts from his theoretical efforts.
Yeah.
And so I don't know for sure whether what you say wouldn't apply to him as well, because he certainly had read a lot. He had a library where there are annotations on so many of the books that we still have in the margins. So it's really clear that he paid attention to that sort of thing. I'm unable to answer your question, but I think it's a great suggestion.
Well, thank you. But basically, it's my own suggestion in the sense of trying to see that perhaps he was already doing something which we only discovered later that he was doing. You know what I mean? Like we came up with the theoretical language centuries later with Francis Bacon, for instance, who at one point says, the idols of the gods, an ancient wisdom. He says, well, it's not expressed in algebra or mathematics, but there is wisdom there in the ancients, at the same time. So let's not toss away, the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, with the arrival of logic and science and mathematics through the 15th century, the 16th century. But anyway, thank you. Maybe I'll stop by your office and we'll continue this.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you to everyone who came today on Zoom in person.
One more thing, Lee, can you stand up and hold that book up?
Well, that'll be easy. Thank God it wasn't a question.
We'll give him a chance around the applause as well. So thank you.
Thanks. Help yourselves to some cheese and crackers.